let's lead into a subject that is not oft discussed, but certainly needs to be, until it's too late sometimes. Scott Philiben, President and Sales for CiES. Tell me what you got here.
So what we set out to do, CiES had approached us in 2010 or so and said, you know, one of our large warranty issues has been fuel indication in the aircraft. And, you know, could we do something? Could we come up with a better way to measure fuel? And we set about it in a relatively workmanlike manner. We built a large plexiglass tank and put it on a boat because a plexiglass aircraft is a little difficult to monitor. Mm-hmm. And we evaluated a group of different technologies in order to see what we could come up with that would meet those requirements. Pretty quickly, we started writing up what would an ideal fuel sender actually do in aviation. One, should tell you, unlike what people are used to, should tell you how much fuel you have in the aircraft. And it should do so consistently and reliably. It should be relatively simple. It should be low cost, so it would meet those requirements that the OEMs were looking for. And we sort of very quickly narrowed in on retaining the float, which we realized would be somewhat of a marketing difficulty. New technology should look new, but we paired it with a modern position sensor, something that's found in modern automobiles for steer-by-wire, brake-by-wire, you know, safety of operation. And this sensor actually lets us know where the float is without touching the float. It has no contact, no physical contact. Mm-hmm. And that allowed us also to meet another requirement that the FAA put on from the TWA 800, where they wanted no electrical energy in the fuel tank itself.
Gee, I wonder why.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. So while that regulation was written for Part 25 aircraft, it was being universally applied to new aircraft manufacturers, Cirrus, Piper, Cessna, and you saw various permutations of how they tried to address it, which basically made it an opening for us, because it took the resistive senders that were nearly marginal in GA and made them absolutely untenable. Mm-hmm. So it gave us an opening to put that in. Knowing what we did at CiES and knowing the success that we had, I mean, basically took one of their largest warranty problems and killed it. We saw an opportunity.
They needed all the help they could get with that at that point.
Yes.
I remember those days real well.
We saw that there was an opportunity for a retrofit system because we had basically made something that was very similar looking, would be very easy sell to the FAA as a retrofit. And then so we went about, again, in a very progressive manner and started certifying most of the GA aircraft available. We've had, because of our association OEM with Garmin, we've gotten Garmin interface, and so, you know, for instance, on the G3X, we're called out by Garmin as an approved sender to be interfaced with their new system. So the aftermarket has worked out very well for us. It's something that I thought that, you know, people would still live with crappy fuel indication, but I'm very surprised every day by the people who call us up, and then also by the advocates of our system. Our early adopters say that they wouldn't do anything else. Mm-hmm. Now that they have accurate fuel level, geez, why did it take so long for this to happen?
I'm glad you're having success on this, because it's obviously a safety-related issue, and for some reason or another, I have found safety to be one of the hardest things to sell in aviation.
It is a very difficult thing. We do things in aviation sometimes because they're religious. Mm-hmm. You know, they sticking your fuel tank, yep, or doing these things. And well, that doesn't tell you what fuel you have in the air, nope, but this is what you've been trained to do, and this is what you do in order to overcome a system that has been substandard. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that all of a sudden you have this and it becomes, Jesus, revelation. You know. But again, it's hard to sell safety. One of the key things about this that was interesting to me is that when I first got into it, my friends who've been in aviation, you know, I've been in aviation my entire career, in fact, my entire life, but you'll get sued.
Yep.
So we have 29,000 senders in the field at this point. We haven't had a single fuel-starved or fuel-exhausted aircraft out of that grouping. So the idea, I know.
That's an impressive stat. That's a really impressive stat.
So when you look at pilots make better decisions with better information, is a better analogy about fuel indication than I just trust my watch.
And for so long, fuel issues have always been a combination of limited information compounded by guesswork.
Yes. and you would get, fuel totalizers became quite popular, probably late 70s, early 80s. And pilots believe they're a panacea for solving fuel-related issues. I trust my fuel totalizer. I always put in exactly what it says.
Yeah.
Right? This has all happened. But I made a presentation to AIs in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and I said, the fuel statistic has stayed relatively stable. That same 2 or 3 people running out of fuel per week has been that way from the 60s through the 70s and 80s. And if fuel totalizers were a safety system, you would have seen a drop in that. And I gave the example of TCAS. Near-miss events were just accelerating in the 80s. TCAS is introduced. They fall down to almost a 0 level, relatively speaking, and then slightly climb with the increasing amount of traffic, but at a wholly different rate. If you introduce a safety system, you should see that sort of feedback, that geez, I've done something and this has given me a good result, instead of sort of a tribal belief that it works, even though the data says it doesn't.
Fascinating. What led you to follow this particular path in aviation?
Oh, geez. I've been relatively successful in designing systems in aviation throughout my career, whether it was at Gulfstream, whether when I was working at Precise Flight and doing systems for CiES like the oxygen or their environmental control or one of those. And so I found sort of this little niche, in addressing difficult problems and solving them. I didn't intend to get into aviation fuel level because I believe, like everybody else growing up, that this was sort of, you just kind of push this away. It was just CiES's introduction to it. And then anytime you start a business, and this was basically a startup, you all of a sudden become an expert. And then as you become an expert and you start asking, why have we accepted this? Well, why did we get this? And you really start delving into all the reasons, even the psychology. I brought the book along, of why we might make decisions that aren't conducive to good piloting related to fuel.
Outstanding. So where do you take your work from here?
Accurate fuel level, leads to automation of other processes in the aircraft. We're working with RDD, who's re-winging, retailing the Lancer 4, and we actually have a system on that aircraft that automates fuel selection in a single-engine aircraft. So now that you have accurate fuel level and you can have the cross-check with a fuel totalizer, now you have a redundant system that allows you to automate systems in the aircraft that we've all relied on, timers and rote knowledge, to actually make flying, again, just like modern avionics, easier, more acceptable for people being introduced into into aviation.
I'll tell you what, it's something to me. My background's flight test, so I see the best and worst of this industry in a number of different areas. And I worked a number of programs and with a number of manufacturers, and it's obvious very quickly that what is attractive and what sizzles sells, and yet it's the little things that at the very best means a pilot walks home, and the very worst something tragic occurs, that just don't necessarily get the attention. I talked to you a little bit, I guess it was last year in Vegas, and then been reading up a little bit more on what you're doing here, but it's interesting to see somebody take on what is quote-unquote a mundane subject and push it through.
Yeah, the interesting, it's also a nice place to be because it's a niche. It's not something, Garmin doesn't find it sexy. which is good for me.
Yeah, you don't expect them to duplicate that tomorrow.
Right.
Oh, you're one of the few then. Oh, my goodness. Well, fascinating stuff. How can people get more information about your product line, how it applies to them? What do they need to know?
You know, our website has quite a bit of information on it. Some of it's in-depth that assists OEMs, but really, you know, most of the avionics install facilities around the U.S. now have familiarity with our system. And if they reach out to, you know, their local avionics shop, they'll get a good, you know, we've gotten a good rapport in the industry. We're very focused on customer service and assisting these shops in addressing issues and problems, and that's reflected in a lot of the repeat business. So just reaching out to their local avionics shop and asking them about us and asking them you know, what they can do to improve fuel indication really helps out to get that personal a bit. And if they want to know more information, you know, certainly our website has lots of information about fuel quantity in our system and why our systems has solved that particular issue in GA aircraft.
Okay. And you've got a pretty wide range of, and throw on your STCs on this?
Yeah, we have everything from Piper Cubs now up to Cessna Twins.
Okay.
We do
not the Piper Cub. I mean, come on, everybody loved the little fuel bobber. I mean, seriously, that's just like defeating America, man. Come on now.
That brings up memories because we had a Piper Cub, or a friend of mine had a Piper Cub, and I grew up around Oshkosh, and we would fly and we would run out of fuel because, you know, we didn't really know because the prop wash would hold the stick against the thing. But, you know, in a Piper Cub, we just landed in a friend's field and then we walked and got more gas and went flying again.
Innocent days.
Very innocent days.
Although I think one of the Piper Cub stories, we had a fellow out in Winter Haven, Florida, who was the best rag cover guy in the world. He was amazing until he passed. He was just Cal Hanks, just an extraordinary fellow. But he had a brand new, I mean, honest to God, wet behind the ears FAA guy come by and want to inspect his shop, and he sees this Cub, and he sees the fuel gauge, and he just blew us all away with, what's that?
Yeah.
Honestly, I had no clue. So I don't know. But at the same time, if you can do it better, go for it.
You know what's interesting to us now? I mean, we have some fairly complex interfaces, like the Cirrus jet. We have the Airbus AS350 helicopter retrofit. We have the Quest Kodiak. We're working a few other programs. But the same unit that we're supplying to that, we're supplying for the Piper Cub. It's not different. So
ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. But it's also kind of neat that on the low end, you get a product that's really functionally capable of doing larger aircraft.
Scott, we really appreciate your time here with Aero-News and the Airborne team. Somewhere down the line, I've got to spend a little bit of time with you in the field and see what you're doing. And we'll look forward to trying to arrange something like that here in the not-too-distant future.
Aero-News Network's coverage of the 62nd Annual AEA International Convention and Trade Show, live from Palm Springs, California, is brought to you in part by the following sponsors.
It's called Airtext Plus. The mobile office is now a true, cost-effective win-win reality because being available and part of the communication chain keeps you in control. Visit us at www.airtext.aero for more information and get started staying in touch today.